open this economy. By not dealing with the commute, we basically undid what was happening with lockdown. So if you deal with the transport sector, because COVID is the virus that moves through the transport sector. If you deal with that effectively, you can actually put in an artificial lockdown through it. So for us, we saw that, we said, great, okay, so we need to come up with solutions.
HIV researcher Dr. Jenny Pfeiffer-Coetzee, founder and director of the African Potential Foundation, says her team has come up with several solutions, ranging from simple to complex.
What we're looking at is a system very similar to what's being used in ambulances, and that is to adapt a UVC air filter that allows the airflow to be encouraged within the taxi using various fans within the filter, and air passes through the filter where it's then irradiated within a matter of seconds, and is then transferred back out into the taxi to be circulated out within the taxi.
Her team is also considering an alarm system that alerts passengers to open the windows to allow fresh air to circulate, sanitizing stations that passengers can use to clean their hands before boarding, and the divider between the driver and passengers. These measures, say Ramaphosa's team, could decrease the risk of infection by up to 80%. So far, SDI has fitted out 5,000 school transport taxis and 1,000 commuter taxis at an estimated cost of about $340,000, much of it provided by donors. Andile Ramaphosa says it's been a steep learning curve, but a worthwhile one.
It's been quite a journey of discovery for us non-scientists to bring all these people together with one thing in mind. We need our people to get to work safely, and we need to save lives.
Pfeiffer-Coetzee says the team is also looking at how to scale the model up to fit other African countries, which use similar transport systems to move millions of people each day. Anita Palavila News, Johannesburg.
In a report looking at women incarceration in Sierra Leone, released last Monday, has revealed overcrowding, harsh punishment for petty crimes, and more human rights issues associated with female imprisonment. Isabella Kodua, a lead researcher of the legal group Advocate, spoke to Ricky Stroyak about the findings.
What stood out to me, for instance, are some of the statistics that we found. For instance, 62% of the women we interviewed were in pretrial detention. Pretrial detention should be used as a measure of last resort. However, that wasn't the case in Sierra Leone, clearly, considering that so many were pretrial detainees. The problem with pretrial detention is that obviously it contributes to overcrowding. This is quite alarming given that there's a pandemic and it spreads, from being close to each other and maybe not having access to water, for instance, which was another problem that we found interviewing the women in prison.
You said there was a lack of access to water. Could you tell me more about those conditions within the prison, and especially given that sanitary conditions are obviously very important to public health at the moment, and always, really?
Yes. So, for instance, in the Freetown Correctional Center, which is in the capital, where most of the women in prison are detained, we found that it was severely overcrowded. In fact, it was initially built to hold about 18 women in prison, and it ended up holding more than 60 at the time. And we even found that some of the offices had been transformed into rooms. We found that some of the women were sharing, so that was really significant considering the situation. And then on top of that, as I said, there was difficulty in accessing water. So even in the centers that were not overcrowded, which are pretty much all of the ones that are outside of the capital, even both the women in prison and the correctional center officers reported that there was oftentimes not enough water, and this obviously posed many problems in terms of hygiene and sanitation, especially for pregnant and menstruating women, for instance.
In Sierra Leone, there is an ongoing problem of women being put in basically debtor's prison. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. So yes, about 34% of the women we interviewed had been imprisoned for economic or petty crime, and obviously I mean, in general, I think when possible, there's a need for non-custodial measures to be put in place so that we have fewer women in prison, and obviously that reduces overcrowding and all of the problems we've already talked about. But more so for women who do not pose a public health and public safety problem, then there are many other options that should be developed in Sierra Leone. And for instance, community-based treatment, community-based diversion.
That was Isabella Kodoa, a lead researcher with the legal group Advocate. She was speaking to Ricky Stryer from Northern Italy. And that's it for this Tuesday, August 11th edition of Daybreak Africa. On behalf of the Daybreak Africa team, producer Nicole Beckford, reporters Peter Clouty and Ricky Stryer, as well as sports editor Samson O'Malley, along with all of our engineers. I'm James Buck, hoping that you will have a great week.
Today's Tuesday, August 11th, and this is VOA's International Edition. I'm Lori London in Washington. Coming up, at the start of a White House briefing Monday, President Trump was quickly whisked off the stage.
I said, can I get back now? They said, yes.
Lebanon's prime minister resigns after a weekend of violent outrage over last week's devastating explosion that flooded Beirut.
Something needs to break. We need to move on. Look at upstairs, there we are.
Also ahead, tensions continue to head toward a boiling point between the U.S. and China. It's all on today's International Edition. Monday's coronavirus update briefing at the White House was pretty unusual, as no sooner did President Donald Trump take to the podium in the briefing room was he abruptly escorted out by a U.S. Secret Service agent.
They just wanted me to step aside for a little while just to make sure it was cleared outside, because it was right in this area.
White House Bureau Chief Steve Herman joins us with an update. Steve, what happened?
Yes, this was a really remarkable scene, Lori. The president taken from the podium, and he said he was taken to the Oval Office while the Secret Service dealt with a security situation. The president then returning to the briefing room lectern a few minutes later and explaining that there was an actual shooting and somebody had been taken to the hospital. And one of the reporters who was at the White House was actually asked by the president what he had heard later in the news conference. And John Roberts, who's with Fox News, said he heard 2 shots in rapid succession just after you took the podium. That's what he told the president from his seat in the Brady briefing.
So what is the Secret Service saying about what happened?
Yes, we don't have a lot of information, Lori, about what exactly happened. What we do know is that there was, according to the Secret Service, an officer-involved shooting at 17th Street and Pennsylvania Avenue. That's quite close to the White House. And that the Secret Service says a male subject and one of its officers were both transported to a local hospital. And the Secret Service is emphasizing at no time during this incident was the White House complex breached or were any protectees in danger.
But a Secret Service officer is hospitalized?
The officer was taken to the hospital. We don't know if there was an injury during the scuffle or if that person possibly had been shot or stabbed. The president said he had been told by agents that subject who was shot had a gun, but that is not confirmed at this time by the Secret Service.
How unusual is something like this? How unprecedented is this?
It's very unusual to see the president, while he was live on television, have somebody come up to him, whisper in his ear, and then have him walk out of the room. We do have lockdowns at the White House quite frequently when there is some sort of security breach or a threat of one, and then everybody has to hold inside until we get the all clear. So that has happened before, but I don't recall one happening while the president was at the briefing podium, live on television, and then had to leave the room.
White House Bureau Chief Steve Herman, thank you so much. The United States set a record for coronavirus cases Saturday. 5 million people now infected. The country has recorded more than 160,000 deaths, nearly a quarter of the world's total. Global coronavirus cases pushed past 20 million Monday, with the U.S., Brazil, and India accounting for more than half of of all known infections. The World Health Organization says the respiratory disease has infected at least 4 times the average number of people struck down with severe influenza illnesses annually. Lebanon's government has resigned after last week's devastating explosion in Beirut and reports of negligence by the country's officials, which unleashed a wave of public anger that added to months of unrest in the country and calls for the government to resign.
We need a total change in the country. The country is run by corrupt gang of people, all helping each other. I mean, they are dividing the cake between each other. In appearance, they might be enemies, but in fact, they're all supporting each other.
As Al Bora reports from Beirut, the resignation of the country's prime minister and his cabinet, though, come as many Lebanese fear that hundreds of millions of dollars in international aid could end up in the pockets of the same politicians whom they hold responsible for the catastrophe.
Thousands of protesters returned to downtown Beirut, the epicenter of protests which first began in October, and said they have had enough. Some called not only for the removal of the political class, but demanded the politicians be hanged. Many Lebanese accused the leadership of ignoring the warnings to dispose of the thousands of tons of ammonium nitrate that caused the explosion. The gigantic explosion left more than 150 dead, 5,000 injured, and as many as 250,000 homes destroyed. Nida Hakim volunteered to clean the streets. She tied a noose to her broom.
This is the broom that I've been using to clean up the houses and the streets of the people who lost everything. And the noose is for the government that has killed us all. Not just the people who died, but all of us, everyone living in Lebanon.
Shortly after Saturday's demonstration began, security forces fired tear gas at protesters who tried to break the cordon around the parliament building. The protesters succeeded in storming the foreign ministry to vent their anger against the establishment. As the evening progressed, uniformed men beat some of the protesters and cleared them. Undeterred, the protesters were back the next day. The protesters want an international panel to investigate the explosion, saying they have no trust in their government. 21-year-old Izar Lahoud came out with his friend. He said he wants politicians dead or thrown out of the country.
They are not thinking about us, they are thinking about their own duties and their self, how to make money. But we are dying here. No politician cares.
The international community is pledging millions in aid. But in a country where graft and mismanagement had already sparked months of unrest before the disaster, there is fear that the money may end up in the pockets of corrupt politicians. Bora for VOA News.
Police in Belarus used stun grenades, tear gas, and water cannon in a crackdown on thousands of protesters who took to the streets of Minsk late Sunday as exit polls showed President Alexander Lukashenko winning about 80% of the vote, while his main challenger had about 7%. International Edition's Steve Miller gets an update from Charles Maines in Moscow.
This election was supposed to be the most challenging of longtime Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko's career, or it appeared to be until the results came in. The official results say that Lukashenko won 80% of the vote, with just 10% going to his most serious challenger. That's Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. She's a housewife who entered this race only because her husband, a popular political blogger and would-be candidate, was denied the ballot and thrown in jail. Now, Tikhanovskaya attracted huge crowds in the run-up to Election Day, and which made this result of 10% look even more suspicious. She's come out today and says she rejects the results. She has proof that just the opposite was true, that she won many of these precincts, and she's appealing to the Electoral Commission. As you noted, thousands came out on the streets last night. Dozens were injured in a tense standoff with Lukashenko's troops in central Minsk and also some other cities around the country. Many will say this was actually quite predictable, that first of all, that Lukashenko would win. He controls the election apparatus. And they also say the protests were predictable. These were huge rallies people basically were waiting to happen.
Poland, Germany, and others have come out saying that the election didn't meet standards. So what can the EU effectively do in this case?
Well, that's right. The EU condemned what they call disproportionate and unacceptable state violence against peaceful protesters. They called for a fair count. But the truth is they probably can do very little. I mean, Belarus is also, Lukashenko, I should say, has often played this kind of game between East and West. He's used Belarus' sort of foreign policy as his bargaining chip, where sometimes he drifts into Russia's orbit, and when it's convenient, he sort of drifts towards Europe. But, I think what's interesting here is the protesters themselves say they don't want a street revolution. They want an honest count. But Lukashenko really has given them little choice but to go out into the streets, and so we're stuck in this showdown between the state security apparatus and a very, very united opposition at this point. I think it's also worth pointing out here that while Lukashenko has faced challenges before and come out ahead, frankly, he's been in power now for 26 years, the only post-Soviet president Belarus is really known. This time people say it's different, and the reason is the COVID pandemic. Lukashenko, people might remember, he paid really little heed to the global pandemic. He mocked it as essentially mass hysteria. And as the body count went up and people got infected and people were having shortages of equipment at hospitals around the country, it wasn't the government that helped out, it was civil society. People stepped in to fill the void. And I think what they